Well, hello. It's great to be speaking to you again on this Thursday Thoughts video. My name's Simon. I'm one of the leaders at Ascot Life Church. And as I've said in previous episodes, we just wanted to make these Thursday Thoughts videos in order to respond to some big questions that we might find ourselves asking now. Questions specifically about faith and God, who we are and what this world is all for. And now you may remember, if you've watched them in previous episodes, that we've asked all sorts of questions about God and his existence, questions about God and suffering, questions even about God and our need for him, whether we really need a relationship with God. But there has been one thing that has featured in each of these videos, and it is, of course, this book, the Bible. Every time that I've been answering or responding to these questions, I've always made reference to what is written in the Bible and what it reports about what Jesus said when he was here on earth. But the one thing we haven't done so far in these videos is pay attention to the Bible itself and ask the question, can we trust what the Bible says? Can we trust what it reports? And of course, this is a very important question for us to ask if we're investigating Christianity. Because, you see, the point of Christianity is to know and follow Jesus. And the way we know who Jesus is through what is written in the Bible. That's why, as Christians, we treasure the Bible so much. It's not because, the words in it are beautiful or the stories are great, the poetry is wonderful, even though in many cases it is. No, the main reason we love the Bible is because it helps us see Jesus. In that respect, the Bible is a bit like a window that helps you see onto the outside world. When you look through a window, you don't stare at the window and the glass. No, you use the window to look beyond to what you can see outside. And in the same way that the Bible is there to help us look through it to see Jesus. But of course, the important thing with a window is that it has to be clean. It has to be uncracked. If the window becomes cracked and broken, then it no longer helps you see. And so we have to ask the question, is the Bible a cracked window? Is the Bible unreliable, or is the Bible a reliable source that can help us know Jesus, help us know what happened 2,000 years ago, and even help us know ourselves? And so it's an important question to ask. Can I trust the Bible? And actually, I think it's so important that I want to ask it over 3 weeks on these videos. I want to look firstly this week about whether we can trust the Bible's reliability. Is the Bible a reliable, accurate source? Secondly, I want to ask whether we can trust the Bible's relevance. Is it relevant for us today, or is it just, an outdated ancient text? And the third thing I want to ask is, can we trust the Bible's morality? Maybe you've read stories, particularly in the Old Testament, that shocked you, and you think, I can't trust that kind of book. I want to look at all these objections we might have to the Bible over the next 3 weeks. But as I say, I want to start by looking at the Bible's reliability. Is it accurate? Can I trust it as a reliable report of what happened to Jesus? I think there are 3 main reasons that we might doubt the Bible's reliability. The first is that we think the Bible has been changed since it was written. The Bible was, of course, written thousands of years ago, and so we might assume that therefore what I have in my hand today isn't really what was written 2,000 years ago, because it's been changed as it's been copied over the centuries. Second reason we might doubt the Bible's reliability is because we suspect that it was written with an agenda. We say that, the authors of this book had a purpose in mind, and therefore we can't trust what they say as truth, because it was all written with an agenda. And the third reason we might distrust the Bible is simply because there are miracles reported in it. You know, things happen in this book which are unusual. People get healed, people get raised from the dead. And so we might say, well, of course we can't trust what the Bible says because it reports things which we know can't have happened. So I just want to look at each of these objections briefly in turn. So firstly, has the Bible been changed over time? Is what I have in my hand right now what was written 2,000 years ago, or has it been altered over the course of history? And actually, I think when you look at the evidence, the overwhelming answer to that question is actually no. The Bible does not seem to have changed much, if at all, since it was first written, so that what I have in my hand now is actually a pretty good report of what was written back then. In fact, if you compare the Bible to other ancient literature we have, it appears as incredibly reliable. You know, there are two main factors which go into determining how reliable an ancient text is. The first is how many copies we have of that ancient text. You know, it won't surprise you to find out that for every work of, ancient civilizations, we don't have the original that the author wrote. You know, we don't have the original of Plato's works or Aristotle's works. What we have instead are manuscripts. We have copies of the original. And of course, it's easy to imagine that the more copies you have of the original, the more easily you can determine what was in the original. Because even though those different copies might have errors, if you have, say, hundreds of them, you can cross-reference them to see what the original wrote. Even though there's errors, you can use them to cancel each other out and determine what was written back then. Well, you see, for most ancient texts, we have around 10 to 50 copies of the original. You know, for those that have the most copies, say Homer's Iliad, we have around 600 or 700 copies of the original. But when you turn to the New Testament, the fact is very different. Turns out that actually the New Testament has around 5,000 full copies in Greek. And that's just the full copies written in the original language. If you expand that to include, copies written in Latin or fragments of the Bible, the number goes up to around 24,000. That is staggeringly different from the number of copies and fragments we have of Homer, 600 versus around 25,000. So you can see on that test, the Bible seems to be a very reliable source. It seems that we can determine with relative accuracy what was written back then, just because we have so many copies. But the second factor that goes into determining how reliable an ancient text is how recent those copies are compared to the original. Again, it'd be easy to imagine that a copy of a document made 10 years after that document would be more accurate than a copy of the document made, say, 1,000 years after that document. You trust the one made 10 years after the document to more accurately reflect what was written in it. Well, again, let's look at other ancient literature. For works like Aristotle, Plato, Homer, the copies we have usually date between around 500 to 1,000 years after the original. The earliest fragment we have of Homer's Iliad dates 500 years after it was originally written in the 8th century BC. Now again, compare that with the New Testament. After just 200 years after the New Testament was written, we have full Greek manuscripts. Just 200 years old. And actually, if you refine that further just to say, when are the most recent fragments? They're only around 25 years after the New Testament was written. So Homer's Iliad, one of the most reliable ancient sources, has a fragment 500 years after, but the New Testament has many full sources only 200 years after. So again, when you look at the manuscripts and copies of the New Testament, it emerges that the New Testament is an incredible, reliable historical source. Has the Bible been changed since it's been written? I think the answer has to be no. We can have almost 100% confidence that what is in our modern Bibles now was what was written thousands of years ago. And if you were to doubt that and say, no, we still need more manuscripts, you'd actually be throwing out all of ancient literature with it. So has the Bible been changed? Has it been altered? I think the answer is no. It's an incredibly reliable historical source in that sense. But of course, that doesn't give us a complete answer to the question, is the Bible reliable? Because we might say, well, it may be true that what we have now was what was written 2,000 years ago, but that still doesn't mean that I can trust it. It doesn't mean that the content is reliable. And as I said at the beginning, there are certain reasons why we might suspect the Bible as falsifying information. The second reason we might doubt the Bible's reliability is because we think it's been written with an agenda. We say, because the authors of this book had an agenda in mind when they wrote this, clearly we can't trust it. But what I'd say to that is that, yes, the Bible has an agenda. Yes, the authors had a purpose in mind, but everything that has been written has an agenda attached to it. It's impossible to write something without having a purpose in mind for what you're writing. Even when I write my shopping lists in the kitchen, I have an agenda attached to it which determine what I write. And so, yes, the Bible has an agenda. In fact, John gives one in the end of his gospel. He says, I write these things so that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Of course, the writers of the Bible had a purpose in mind when they wrote it. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily are falsifying information. The question we have to ask is not, does the Bible have an agenda? Of course it does. The question we have to ask is, does this purpose distort what has been written? Does it mean that false facts have been passed over as truth? And I think actually there are a few indications in the Gospels in particular which show us that what we are reading is in fact the truth. It is in fact close to what has happened. Firstly, because the authors of the Gospels, the disciples, routinely represent themselves in embarrassing ways. They report stories where they are slow to understand, where they're selfish, where they get things wrong, where they mess up. Now, those are stories which, if you were trying to, cover things up, if you were trying to make yourself look good, you wouldn't include them. But instead, we see again and again the disciples, the writers of the Bible, they report these things, which suggests that they're being honest. It suggests that, when they pass on the information, they're not covering things up and falsifying, although they're just passing on the bare facts. But the second reason I think the Bible reports things in a truthful way is because, when the disciples write their stories about Jesus, they do so in subtly different ways. If you have 4 witnesses to an incident, you would see them as unreliable, firstly, if they all disagreed on information. If one said this happened, another said that happened, you would think that they're all unreliable if none of them can agree. But on the other hand, if they all say exactly the same thing, if they all say exactly the same details, exactly the same wording, then you'd see them also as unreliable because, well, they've clearly colluded. They've joined together to say the exact same thing and are clearly trying to cover something up. No, what you want if you're an investigator is for all your witnesses to say similar things, but say it in subtly different ways with slightly different angles. And that's actually what we see when we compare the four Gospels. They are subtly different. They have slightly different turns of phrase, slightly different angles on events, which seems to suggest that what we're reading here is not, four men colluding to write the same thing, but actually four different eyewitnesses just writing what they've seen and heard. So that's the second reason why I think that we have truth written to us in the Bible, is because these disciples seem to have just been honest eyewitnesses passing on what they've seen. But then that leads us to the third reason why we might distrust the Bible, and that's because there were miracles in it. Maybe you've got to the end of this video and you're saying, I don't care about the manuscripts, I don't care about, the disciples being honest. The Bible clearly can't be trusted because it reports miracles. It reports healings and resurrections, which we know didn't happen. And let me just say, I get that. I understand that, when you read a story that involves, miracles and, supernatural things, you often don't assume that it's telling a true story. But I would just say a couple things to that, if that's your objection. The first thing I'd say is that the people writing these stories found the miracles just as surprising, just as unexpected as we do. That's why they wrote them down. That's why they, noted them down for people afterwards, was because they were so surprised by the miracles. They weren't expecting them. They knew that dead people don't rise. They knew that people don't just get healed by someone touching them. But the second thing I'd say to you, if your objection to the Bible is just that it involves miracles, is that I'd say be careful that you don't approach the Bible in a closed-minded manner. Because actually, what you're doing if you dismiss the Bible simply because it has miracles is you are taking your worldview, your view of the world that says miracles don't happen, and then using that worldview to ignore and screen out anything to the contrary. You're saying, because I have this view of the world that miracles don't happen, therefore, if there's any report, it's clearly wrong. Actually, that's not a good way to do investigation. It's not a good way to do science. No, the right way to investigate something is to come at it with your worldview, to say, I think this is how the world is. But when you are presented with evidence to the contrary, the right thing to do is not ignore it just because it doesn't fit your worldview, your grid, but it's to say, is this true? Can I evaluate this? And if it's true, then, well, I might have to change my worldview. Maybe miracles can happen. Maybe there is such a thing as a miracle taking place. And of course, the third thing I'd say is, if there is a God who exists, and if he has chosen to reveal himself, surely one of the main ways he'd do it is through miracles, through things we don't usually see. Just because the New Testament records miracles doesn't mean we have to cast it out because we know those things don't happen. No, maybe what we're reading here is something that doesn't usually happen, and that's because God is breaking in. Maybe that's because Jesus came to reveal something that we haven't seen before. So those are, I think, a few reasons why I think the Bible is actually more reliable than we might think. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't spoken much about the Old Testament here, just confine my attention to the New Testament and the Gospels really, but that's because in future episodes we will look at the relevance and the morality of the Old Testament. But just before I finish this video, I'd just love to say one more thing. The best way to see whether the Bible is true and reliable is not to analyze it from the outside, but it's actually just to get into it, to read it, or to go with the analogy we used earlier, to look through the window and see if it shows us something. And I think that the best way to see whether the Bible is reliable is to read it and see, does it speak to me? Does it reveal truth to me? And if you'd like to look into the Bible a bit more, I'd love to invite you to one of our Sunday meetings. We live stream these at Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock on Facebook and YouTube. And part of that time will just be looking at the Bible together and looking to hear God through it. You'd be more than welcome to just sit at home, watch along, see if you can hear God speak to you through the words of this book. But as I say, that's all I've got to say on this first question about the Bible's reliability. I look forward to speaking to you in different episodes down the line, but I do hope that's been helpful, and have a great week until I speak to you again soon. Thanks.